The Grand Conclave of Velshoreth sat at the crossroads of 3 star systems, carved from the core of an ancient asteroid and expanded over centuries into something so vast and so layered that entire species got lost inside it for weeks. It was neutral ground, sacred ground, the one place in the known galaxy where 42 civilizations had agreed to keep their weapons holstered and their voices carefully measured. Every corridor carried the scent of a different world, burnt copper drifting from the Cathari wing, something sweet and almost floral from the Soluvian quarter, and a low electrical hum that the Velshoreth themselves apparently found soothing but that gave most humans a splitting headache within the first 10 minutes of arrival. Corporal Devon Holt had been on the station for exactly 4 hours and already had a headache. He was not supposed to be the important one on this trip. That had been made very clear from the moment the assignment was handed to him. His job was to stand near the human trade delegation, look sharp, and make sure nobody walked off with the ambassador's briefcase. Simple. Clean. The kind of job that required a warm body, a pressed uniform, and the ability to stand still for long periods while important people talked around him. The problem with simple assignments, in Devon's experience, was that they had a talent for getting complicated at the worst possible moment. The briefcase had wheels. The ambassador had forgotten to lock them. And somewhere between the docking bay and the grand reception hall, a stretch of corridor that should have taken 8 minutes to walk, the briefcase had rolled, the ambassador had lunged for it, the 2 junior diplomats had lunged for the ambassador, and Devon had been swept cleanly in the opposite direction by a moving wall of tall, formally dressed aliens who navigated these corridors with the effortless precision of beings who had been doing this for 500 years and had absolutely no patience for anyone who hadn't. Within 3 minutes, he was thoroughly, completely, and somewhat impressively lost. He tried 2 lefts and a right, found himself in a corridor full of what appeared to be ceremonial plants that were definitely watching him, backed out carefully, tried a different route, and eventually pushed through a set of tall arched doors simply because they were the only doors he could find and his boots were starting to pinch. The room beyond was long and narrow and very, very quiet. Silver panels lined the walls, catching light and redistributing it in soft angles. The floor was some kind of dark stone, polished smooth enough to reflect the ceiling. Guards stood at precise intervals, tall, silver-armored beings with the pale grey skin and sharp, elegant features of the Thyronai people, each one perfectly motionless, each one staring at Devon with an expression he could only describe as system error. None of them spoke. None of them moved. And at the far end of the corridor, standing alone beside a wide viewport that looked out over a stretch of stars so dense they seemed almost solid, was a woman. She was tall the way all Thyronai were tall, unhurried about it, built like someone who had never once had to reach for a shelf. Her skin was a deep and steady violet, her hair silver white and arranged in some kind of architectural construction that probably had a name and a cultural significance Devon would spend the rest of his life not understanding. Her gown moved slowly even though the air in the room was still, and it caught the starlight from the viewport and held it the way water holds color. She was holding a thin glass of something blue and luminous in one hand, and she was staring out at the stars with the tight, controlled expression of someone carrying something very heavy and refusing to let it show. Devon knew that expression. He had seen it on his older sister the morning of her wedding, on his commanding officer the night before a difficult operation, on every person who had ever been handed more than was fair and told to look fine while managing it. It was the face of someone who needed 5 minutes to be a person instead of a title. He walked over. Behind him, the sound that rippled through the guards was something extraordinary, a sharp, collective intake of breath, like a room full of people watching someone step off a ledge, followed by an absolute and paralyzed silence, because no one had protocol for this, because there was no protocol for this, because nothing like this had ever happened in the 500-year history of this corridor. The Royal Private Hall of the Thyronai delegation did not appear on public maps. It required specific clearance at 3 separate checkpoints, and even then, only beings of verified senior diplomatic rank with pre-approved purposes were permitted within 20 feet of its entrance. Devon had walked through the door because it was the only door available. He stopped at a comfortable distance, close enough to talk, far enough to give her space, tilted his head the way he always did when he was genuinely checking on someone, and said the thing he would later be told had caused for Thyronai court officials to require medical attention when they reviewed the security footage. "Hey sweetie, you look like you could use some air. You okay?" The silence after that was not just a silence, it was a monument to itself. One guard made a sound like a machine trying to restart. Another grabbed the wall behind him with both hands. A small attendant near the entrance door dropped her data tablet, and it hit the stone floor with a sound like a struck bell, and no one picked it up because no one in that room was able to perform a voluntary action at this specific moment in time. Princess Assyrial Vas Thyron, 32nd heir to the Thyronai throne, commander of the Silver Choir, holder of 6 formal titles that each required their own introductory clause, fluent in 9 galactic languages and trained since childhood in the precise social and political weight of every syllable spoken in formal company, turned and looked at the human. He was shorter than expected. He had dark, easy eyes and an open posture and the specific expression of someone who had arrived somewhere entirely by accident and was too comfortable in his own skin to find that embarrassing. And he was still waiting for her answer. Not performing. Not calculating. Not reading the room for advantage or political angle. He had asked a question and he was waiting, with the kind of genuine, uncomplicated patience that Assyrial had not encountered in any diplomatic interaction in her entire life, for her to simply answer it. She had been briefed on humans before the conclave. Every delegation had been briefed, because humanity was new and strange and the galaxy had decided to watch them carefully. The briefing document had described humans as emotionally impulsive, socially unpredictable, and prone to informal communication in formal environments. The briefing had not covered this specific quality, this complete and total absence of calculation in a single person's eyes. She opened her mouth to deliver a measured and dignified response. What came out was, yes, I think, no, I am not entirely certain. And then, without permission, without precedent, without any explanation she could reach for in the moment, her cheeks flushed. Not a social warmth, not the polite color that sometimes accompanied a well-received compliment. This was the deep, involuntary, luminous violet bloom that rose in the skin of a Thyronai when something happened that the soul recognized before the mind had a chance to form an opinion about it. Her handmaiden across the room went very still and pressed both hands carefully over her mouth. The senior guard appeared to have forgotten how to blink. Davin looked at her cheeks, looked at her face, and said, with genuine, straightforward concern, "You're looking a little purple there. You sure you're not running a fever?" And Assyrial Vas Thyron laughed. It was small and startled and over almost immediately, pulled back behind 500 years of royal training and the muscle memory of composed features, but it had happened. Every person in that corridor had heard it, and not one of them would ever forget it, not for the rest of their very long lives. The wrong human had walked through the wrong door at exactly the right moment, and the galaxy, though it didn't know it yet, had just changed. The order came from Princess Assyrial herself, delivered through her senior attendant in the precise, formal language of Thyronai court correspondence, and it arrived at the human delegation's temporary quarters at the conclave like something that had been thrown through the window. The princess wished the human, specifically Corporal Davin Holt, to be made available for informal conversation during the following day's unscheduled hours. Ambassador Reese read the message 3 times, then a 4th time in case the translation software had failed her. Then she walked to where Davin was sitting on his bunk, eating a protein bar with the relaxed posture of a man who had not yet been told that he had become an interstellar incident, and she stared at him for a long and quiet moment. "What exactly did you do?" she asked. "Talk to someone," said Davin. "Who?" "Lady in a hallway. She looked stressed. I asked if she was okay." Ambassador Reese sat down slowly on the opposite bunk. "Davin," she said, "that lady was Princess Assyrial Vas Thyron, heir to the Thyronai Empire, one of the 5 most politically significant beings currently on this station, and you walked into her private royal corridor without clearance, without a greeting protocol, without any form of prior authorization, and you called her sweetie." Davin considered this. "Is that a problem?" "We don't know yet," said Ambassador Reese, which was somehow the most unsettling answer she could have chosen. She assigned him a diplomatic escort and a crash course in Thyronai greeting protocols that lasted 4 hours and that Davin retained approximately none of, and the following morning he was walked to the neutral lounge on level 7 where the princess was waiting with 2 attendants, a senior guard, and an expression of composed and careful curiosity. Davin walked in, looked at her, and said, "Hey, you're looking better today. Less purple." The 2 attendants exchanged a glance that could have meant almost anything. Assyrial tilted her head, a gesture that in Thyronai culture signaled either deep consideration or deep offense, and even her own advisors were not always certain which, and then she said, very carefully, "I am told that your greeting yesterday was informal even by human standards." "Probably," Davin agreed, dropping into the nearest seat with the ease of someone who had never once considered whether he had the rank to sit before being invited. "I just said what I saw. You look like you needed someone to check in." She stuttered him. "And you did not know who I was?" "No idea." "And if you had known?" He thought about it for a genuine moment. probably would have said the same thing. You still would have looked stressed. A silence followed. Then Asiriel sat across from him with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision they were going to have to explain later, and she said, "Tell me something about humans." And Davin, because he was exactly who he appeared to be, said, "What do you want to know?" What followed over the next 3 days was something that no diplomat, cultural researcher, or xenoanthropologist at the conclave could have designed or predicted, because it wasn't designed. It was simply two people talking. Davin told her about Earth. Not the formal kind of Earth that appeared in Humanities Observer applications, not the statistics and the political structures and the carefully assembled profile of a species presenting its best self to the galaxy, but the actual, ordinary, complicated Earth. He told her about his grandmother's cooking, about football games played in the rain, about the strange human custom of staying up well past midnight for no particular reason except that the night felt good and nobody wanted to go home yet. Asiriel had never had a conversation like it. Every diplomatic interaction she had ever been part of had a shape, a beginning, a structure, a clear objective that everyone in the room understood. Even her personal conversations within the royal household moved along understood paths, because she had been raised in a world where every word carried weight and every question had a purpose behind it. Davin talked the way water moved, freely, changing direction without announcement, looping back on itself, stopping to point at things that interested him along the way. She found it deeply strange. She found it impossible to stop listening to. On the second day, they crossed paths with a Kthari delegation in the main diplomatic corridor. The Kthari were large, larger than most species at the conclave, grey-scaled, heavy-jawed, and possessed of a cultural tradition that involved almost no smiling and absolutely no casual conversation with beings they had not formally acknowledged as worthy of their time. Warlord Grak Vas Tetun was the senior Kthari delegate, a being who had led 6 military campaigns and who was known across 3 sectors specifically for the quality of his silences. He moved through corridors the way storm fronts moved across plains, with weight and direction and the distinct impression that things would be wise to get out of the way. Davin looked up at him, up being very much the operative word, given the height difference, and said with a friendly tilt of his head, "Hey, big guy, are these corridors getting narrower or are you just really wide?" Every human diplomat within earshot stopped breathing. Warlord Grak stared down at Davin for a long, absolutely airless moment. And then he laughed. Not a polite diplomatic acknowledgement, a real laugh, deep and rough and genuinely surprised. The laugh of someone caught completely off guard by something and too startled to perform anything other than the actual reaction. He looked at Davin with something approaching delight and said, in heavily accented standard, "You are very strange, small human." "Yeah, I get that a lot," said Davin. Grak walked on. But 3 members of his delegation looked back over their shoulders, and by that evening word had spread through the Kthari wing that the human had made the warlord laugh, and the Kthari delegation formally requested that Davin be seated near them at the following day's dinner, the first time in 30 years they had requested the company of any outside species at a private meal. Asiriel watched all of this from 3 steps back, and something shifted very quietly in her understanding of the universe. The galaxy she had been raised and ran on a specific kind of power, formal, structural, hierarchical, the power of rank and title and the careful management of who was allowed to speak to whom and in exactly what tone. She had been trained in that power since childhood and she was genuinely excellent at it. She had spent her entire life understanding how it worked, how to use it, how to move within it. But Davin operated on something else entirely. He walked through rooms that had been specifically built to make beings feel the weight of their position, and he just didn't feel the weight. Not because he was performing confidence, not because he was making some deliberate point about humanity, not because he was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because he genuinely did not carry the thing that everyone around him spent their entire lives managing. He was not afraid. In a galaxy constructed entirely on the careful architecture of fear, fear of rank, fear of consequence, fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong moment in the wrong corridor, this human corporal with his easy smile and his total absence of political instinct was the single most unusual thing Asiriel had ever had the chance to watch up close. And she had been watching very closely. On the 3rd afternoon, they sat together on the observation deck and watched a cargo freighter drift slowly past the viewport, and Davin told her about a road trip he had taken with 3 friends when he was 20, a story that had no political significance whatsoever and no conclusion that would have satisfied any diplomat, and Asiriel laughed twice, both times catching herself half a second too late. Her handmaiden, who had accompanied her that day and was sitting at a careful distance with a datapad she was pretending to read, noted the laughs in her personal record with a small and private smile. That evening, in the quiet of her private chamber, Serial sat at her writing desk for a long time and did not write anything. The thoughts she was having did not have the right shape for writing. They were too soft and too honest and too new. She had tried 3 times to organize them into something she could examine clearly, and all 3 times they had refused to organize. Her handmaiden, who had served her for 11 years and knew every quality of her silences, sat in the chair near the door and said nothing. And the deep violet that rose quietly in Serial's cheeks in that warm, still moment was not something that either of them mentioned out loud, but it was not something either of them forgot. It started, as most political problems at the conclave did, with a document. Ambassador Krex of the Velshoreth Oversight Council was a tall, thin being with pale gold eyes and the particular kind of patience that comes from 4 decades in interstellar diplomacy, the patience of someone who had learned that the correct response to almost any situation was to wait and see, because the galaxy had a reliable habit of solving its own small problems before they became large ones. The human, however, was becoming a large one with considerable speed. The formal complaint filed by Krex's office was 3 pages long, translated into standard from the original Velshoreth, and it listed 9 specific violations committed by Corporal Davin Holt of the Human Observer Delegation in the space of 72 hours. Violation 1. Unauthorized entry into a restricted royal corridor. Violation 2. Addressing a member of foreign royalty without completing mandatory greeting protocols. Violation 3. Informal physical contact, specifically, a friendly pat on the shoulder given to said royal, which Davin had apparently done on the second morning when Serial had looked tense again, because that was simply the thing he did when people looked tense and he liked them. Violation 4. Informal address of a senior Kthari military official in a formal corridor. Violations 5 through 9 were variations on a theme, essentially, Davin existing in formal spaces and behaving like himself. Ambassador Reese read through the document twice, asked for an hour, then asked for a second hour. By the end of the 3rd hour she had prepared a formal response and sent a short message to Davin that read simply, "Please stop being yourself for the next 48 hours. Davin sent back, "I'll try but I make no promises." The formal hearing before the Observer Council was scheduled for the following morning, and Reese walked in prepared for a difficult session, ready to apologize, to mitigate, to do the careful diplomatic work of making the situation smaller than it had become. What she was not prepared for was the counter-documentation that had arrived overnight on the Council's desk from 6 different delegations. The Kthari delegation formally requested that Corporal Holt be assigned as a permanent liaison to their sessions, something no delegation had ever requested of any human, because the concept of voluntarily seeking extended time with a human representative had simply not occurred to anyone at the conclave before this week. The Soluvian Merchant Council sent a personal note from their queen, indicating that she found the human's company unexpectedly refreshing and wished to arrange a formal walk with him through the trade corridor, a walk that was, in Soluvian culture, one of the highest forms of public endorsement one being could offer another. 3 smaller delegations submitted notices of interest, indicating that they were following the human's movements with growing curiosity and wished to be included in any future interactions that might be arranged. Ambassador Krex read through all of this documentation with the careful expression of a being whose neatly constructed problem had just rearranged itself into something he did not have a category for. The hearing proceeded. The violations were acknowledged. Davin sat in the visitors' gallery in his dress uniform, hands folded, looking genuinely interested in the proceedings the way a person looks interested in a documentary about something that has nothing directly to do with them. When Krex read through the list of infractions, Davin nodded along in quiet agreement, as if confirming that yes, these were all things that had happened. The Council voted to issue a formal caution and restrict the human delegation's access to certain corridors for the remainder of the conclave. By noon, the Kthari warlord had sent a private communication to the Council indicating that any formal restriction placed on the humans' movement would be interpreted by his delegation as a restriction on their own access, since they had formally and publicly requested his presence. The caution was quietly revised to a written notice. Meanwhile, Serial was fighting her own war, and it was entirely internal, and she was losing it. She had built a comprehensive case in her own mind for why the situation was manageable and contained. She had catalogued her interactions with Davin with the precision of a diplomat reviewing treaty terms, identifying each exchange, noting each moment of unexpected laughter, each instance of feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like a person rather than a position. The case for manageable had 4 strong and well-constructed points. The case against it had only one, but that one was the kind of point that didn't care about strong arguments on the other side. She thought about him constantly. Not in a distracted way, She was far too trained for distraction to ever find a proper foothold in her daily work, but in the way of something that had become a background constant, a persistent and quiet awareness that sat behind everything else she was doing and simply waited there with no urgency and no apology. Her handmaiden had not said anything about it. She was too wise and too experienced for that. But she had started quietly leaving 2 cups out when she prepared the morning tea, and had said nothing when a serial noticed, and neither of them had discussed it at any point. On the 4th evening of the conclave, everything changed colour. The Pure Sovereignty, a block of 7 civilizations that had been a permanent fixture of galactic politics for over 2 centuries, united by the shared and deeply held conviction that the galaxy's older and more established species had a responsibility to manage its younger ones carefully and keep them at a respectful distance, called a formal press assembly in the conclave's media corridor. Their speaker was a being called High Voice Sareth, a Velshoreth elder who had held his position for 30 years and who spoke in the measured, unhurried cadence of someone who had long ago learned to make silence work harder than volume. He stood before the assembled press and diplomatic observers and said, with great and patient calm, that the purest sovereignty had followed the events of the past 4 days with genuine concern. He said that the behavior of the human individual at the center of these events represented exactly the kind of unpredictability that had been raised as a concern when humanity's observer application was first submitted. He said that certain species were not yet ready for the full weight of galactic engagement, and that no amount of charming individual interactions changed the structural reality of that fact. And then he said it, clearly, with the full weight of 7 civilizations standing behind him, that if the Thyranai royal family continued to associate publicly and warmly with a species as unformed as humanity, the purest sovereignty would be forced to file a formal motion calling for a review of humanity's observer status, a review that, in their considered estimation, would very likely result in its complete revocation. He also used the word quarantine. The word moved through the assembled observers like a stone dropped into still water, slow, wide, impossible to stop once it had started. Major Delaney found Davin 22 minutes later in the station cafeteria, eating something of alien origin that he had picked up from a vendor because it looked interesting and smelled like cinnamon. She sat down across from him, folded her hands carefully on the table, and looked at him with the expression of someone delivering information they had not asked to be the one to deliver. Davin, she said, I need you to understand something. You have accidentally become an interstellar political crisis. Davin looked up from his food. By being friendly? He asked. By being yourself, said the Major. Which, as it turns out, is equally threatening to certain people in this galaxy. Davin looked back down at his food for a long moment. He thought about a cereal, about the way she had laughed in that corridor, small and startled and real. He thought about Grak, who had laughed for the first time in 11 years because someone had spoken to him like a person instead of a title. He thought about the Soluvian Queen asking for a walk, and the small delegations sending their notices of interest, and all the quiet ways the past 4 days had suggested that the galaxy was maybe a little lonelier than it had been letting on. He picked up his food again. Huh, he said. Same as every Tuesday back home. Major Delaney put her head in her hands. Outside the cafeteria window, the stars of 3 different systems burned in the dark, patient and unconcerned, the way stars always are when the small bright things beneath them are working out what matters. The Grand Hall of Velshoreth could hold 3,000 beings at full capacity, and on the morning of the sovereignty motion, it was at full capacity. Every delegation had sent its complete complement of representatives. The upper galleries were packed with observers, press correspondents, and diplomatic aides who had been told that something significant was about to happen and had decided that watching it in person was better than reading about it the next morning. The air had the particular electric quality that large rooms get when everyone inside them is waiting for the same thing and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. The human delegation sat in the observer section, a curved row of seats near the back left of the main floor, separated from the primary delegations by a low barrier that was symbolic rather than structural, a polite architectural reminder of their status as guests rather than full members of the assembly. Ambassador Reese sat at the front of the row, straight-backed, hands folded, already composing in her mind the diplomatic response she would need regardless of which direction the vote went. Davin was not there. He had been told, in very clear terms, by Major Delaney and Ambassador Reese and the station's own security coordinator, that he was not permitted inside the Grand Hall during the session. His access badge had been recalibrated to exclude the hall's entry checkpoints, and a member of the diplomatic staff had been specifically assigned to stay with him in the delegation quarters for the full duration of the proceedings. The delegation staff member was currently asleep on the couch. Davin was in the Grand Hall. He had found a maintenance access corridor that ran behind the upper gallery and connected, through a door that was technically reserved for emergency use and was not technically alarmed, to the back of the standing observer area on the topmost tier. He was there now, hands in his pockets, watching the proceedings below with the calm interest of a man who had been in places he wasn't supposed to be before and had long ago learned that the best strategy was to stand still and look like you already belonged there. High-voiced Sareth of the purest sovereignty was speaking from the main floor. His voice filled the hall with practiced ease, unhurried, resonant, each word placed with the care of someone who had spent 30 years understanding that language, used correctly, was the most powerful tool in any room. He spoke about the order of the galaxy, the careful, centuries-built structure of shared civilization that had allowed 42 species to share space, to trade, to coexist without consuming one another. He spoke about the responsibility of older civilizations to maintain that order, and about the serious danger of introducing into it elements that did not understand what it had cost to build. And then he arrived at the humans. He said they were too young. He said they were too impulsive. He said they were, by every measurable galactic standard, primitive, and he delivered that word without cruelty, with the smooth and practiced warmth of someone who believed that condescension was still a form of kindness when it was delivered gently enough. He said that a species which had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, that communicated in informal and unpredictable ways, that appeared entirely unequipped to navigate the social and diplomatic architecture of the galactic community, was simply not a species that could be trusted with the access and exposure that observer status provided. He said it was not a punishment, it was simply responsible governance. Up in the back gallery, Davin started laughing. Not quietly. Not a small breath of amusement hidden politely behind a closed fist, an actual, out-loud, fully committed laugh, the laugh of someone who had just heard something so precisely and perfectly backwards that the only honest response was to find it funny. 3,000 beings turned and looked up at the gallery. Sareth stopped speaking. In the observer section far below, Ambassador Reese pressed both hands flat on the desk in front of her and stared at the ceiling with the expression of a person experiencing a very specific kind of spiritual moment. Davin leaned forward on the gallery railing and called down into the hall, easy, warm, not performing a single thing. Brother, I have to be completely honest with you. That is genuinely the nicest thing anyone has ever said about us. The hall held its breath. Then Davin continued, and his voice carried the way voices do when a room has gone completely silent to receive them. Emotionally impulsive, unpredictable, don't know the rules. Yeah, that's fair. All of that is fair. But here's the thing. We've been that way the whole time. And the Kthari warlord laughed for the first time in 11 years. And the Soluvian queen asked someone she'd never met to walk with her. And people who hadn't connected with anyone in a very long time connected, because someone came in here and just talked to them like they were people and not positions. If being primitive means being the thing that reminds everyone else what it feels like to just be a person for 5 minutes, I will take that every single time. A very long silence followed, the kind of silence that means a room is thinking rather than just waiting. Then a voice rose from the main floor. It was precise and clear, and it carried the full natural authority of 500 years of royal standing behind every word, not because it was loud, but because it was completely certain of itself. Princess Assyriel Vast Thyron had stood up. She had broken 14 separate protocols by doing so without prior recognition from a chair. She knew this. She stood up anyway. She did not speak loudly. She had never needed to. The room gave her its complete and immediate attention without being asked, the way rooms always did when the person speaking had never once in their life needed to raise their voice to be heard. She said that the Thyronai Empire had been a member of this conclave for 5 centuries. She said that in those 5 centuries, they had seen many species rise to full galactic standing, and many more fail to reach it, and that the difference between those two groups had never once been the size of their fleets or the age of their civilization or the smoothness of their diplomatic language. She said the difference had always been this, whether or not a species could look at a complete stranger and see someone worth talking to. She said that a species which sent an unarmed corporal into the galaxy's most formal diplomatic space and had him ask a stranger if she was okay, with no agenda, no calculation, no political objective of any kind, was a species that had not forgotten something the rest of the assembled galaxy had been quietly losing track of for a very long time. She paused, and the hall stayed with her. She said that in her personal view and the formal view of the Thyronai throne, that was not a reason to close the door on humanity. It was the only reason that truly mattered for keeping it open. The motion was called to a vote. It failed, not narrowly, but clearly, with 14 delegations switching their indicated positions between the morning briefing and the moment the actual vote was recorded. Afterward, the hall emptied slowly, the way halls do after something real has happened in them, and as Serial moved through the careful congratulations and careful questions and the careful attention of 1,000 beings who each wanted a moment of her time. She answered everything with grace and patience and the composed steadiness of someone who had been trained for exactly this kind of moment. But she was also looking for someone. She found the eastern observation deck after 20 minutes of careful navigation through thinning crowds, a wide room with a single long viewport and a view of the densest starfield on the station's eastern side, the same viewport she had been standing at alone 4 days ago when a human had walked in and changed the direction of things. Davin was already there. He was leaning against the wall beside the viewport, looking out at the stars with his hands in his pockets and the quiet expression of someone who had said what he came to say and was now simply glad to be standing somewhere peaceful. She moved to stand beside him. For a while neither of them spoke, which was unusual for him, and came naturally to her, and together it made a comfortable kind of silence that surprised her. Then she said, "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "The flush," she said, because she had decided to say it plainly, without dressing it up or finding a softer way around it. In Thyronite culture, the violet color, it is not a social response. It is not something we choose or perform. It appears when the body recognizes something that the mind has not yet had time to put a name to, something that changes the shape of what comes next. She looked out at the stars. "It has happened to me exactly once," she said. The silence that followed was the warm and easy kind, the kind that only exists between two people who are both in the same place about something and are taking a moment to let that be real. Davin turned and looked at her with his easy eyes and his unhurried smile, the same smile he had given her in the corridor when she had asked if he knew who she was and he had said no and hadn't seemed bothered by it at all. "Well then, darling," he said quietly, "I'd say we've got a lot to talk about." And for the second time, deep and luminous and completely involuntary, her cheeks glowed violet. She didn't reach for an explanation. She didn't try to organize it into something she could examine from a distance. She just let it be what it was, which was, she was beginning to understand, the most human thing she had ever done. The closing ceremonies of the Grand Conclave of Velshoreth were traditionally a quiet affair. Not silent, 42 civilizations sharing a single enormous room produced a constant low current of sound even at their most restrained, but quiet in the way that things go quiet after something real has moved through them, the particular calm that settles when everyone in a space is still turning the same thought over and hasn't yet decided what to say about it. What everyone was turning over was humanity. More specifically, what everyone was quietly thinking about was one human, a low-ranking military escort who had walked into the galaxy's most formal diplomatic space and treated it like a neighborhood he had lived in all his life, and what exactly that meant for the shape of things going forward. The formal motion to upgrade humanity from observer status to candidate membership was submitted on the third morning of the closing proceedings. It was a motion that, under normal circumstances, required a minimum of 300 years of active galactic engagement, 2 formally documented diplomatic achievements of major significance, and a unanimous recommendation from at least 30 member civilizations. The motion was submitted not by the human delegation, who were honestly still too stunned by the previous 4 days to have put something like this together in time, but by the Soluvian Merchant Council, co-signed by 4 other delegations, and accompanied by a formal supporting statement that ran to 6 carefully argued pages. Ambassador Reese read the document and had to sit down. She read it a second time and stayed sitting. Davin was informed of the motion while eating breakfast and said, "Good for us," and went back to his food with the easy contentment of a person who had not yet fully measured the scale of what had just shifted. The debate on the motion was scheduled for 2 hours. It ran for 5, because 15 delegations submitted speaking requests and not one of them was brief. The most significant moment came from a direction no one had predicted. Warlord Grak Vast Tetun of the Kthari had not submitted a speaking request. The Kthari, as a long-standing rule, did not make speeches at conclave sessions. They filed their positions in writing and let the document do the speaking, because standing before an assembly and making a case out loud was, in Kthari culture, something you did only when you had failed to make the point clearly enough in advance. But Grak stood up anyway. He stood without requesting the floor, and the chamber gave it to him immediately, because that was simply what the chamber did when Grak Vast Tetun decided to stand. He was quiet for a moment after rising, which in Kthari communication was the equivalent of a very long and deliberate opening statement. Then he said, "The human made me laugh." The room held very still. "I had not laughed in 11 years," he continued, with the directness of a being who had never in his life learned to dress a statement up in softer clothes. Not because nothing was funny, but because every room in this conclave is a room where you are being watched, where every word and gesture is noted and measured and filed and used later by someone. The human walked in and he was just there. Just a person. Not performing anything for anyone. Not calculating his position. And I laughed because I had forgotten what it felt like to stand in a room with someone who was entirely themselves without any cost to it. He paused, and the hall paused with him. I believe, he said, that any species still capable of that is already more civilized than most of us currently in this room. He looked once around the assembled delegations. I support the motion. He sat down. 2 senators from opposing civilizations that had not agreed on a single point of order in 40 years both began applauding at the same moment, realized simultaneously what they were doing, looked across the floor at each other, and kept going. The motion passed. Humanity's path to full membership would still require years of process. There were formal criteria that couldn't be skipped and evaluation periods that couldn't be shortened, but the door that had been barely cracked open was now standing wide, and the people who had worked hardest to close it had gone noticeably quiet. The Thyranai delegation held a private closing dinner that evening, small and formal, the kind of gathering that operated by its own internal warmth and was not included in any official record. Isiriel attended, as was her duty. So did her senior advisors, her handmaiden, and the 4 ranking members of her diplomatic staff. And, because Isiriel had requested it personally and her senior advisor had decided this was a battle not worth choosing, Davin attended as well. He wore his dress uniform, which was somewhat underdressed for the occasion but which he carried well. He shook every hand he was offered, said nice to meet you to a collection of beings who had collectively shaped 4 decades of galactic policy, and asked one of the senior ministers whether the small pastry-like food on the side table was sweet or savory, because he wanted to make an informed decision. The minister told him it was both. Davin took 2. At the end of the dinner, the Thyranai Chancellor, Isiriel's great-uncle, a being who had held his position for 60 years and who moved through public life with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste a single action, stood and made a quiet announcement. He said the Thyranai Empire wished to formally mark the events of the conclave with a personal acknowledgement. He said it was the Empire's tradition, in exceptional circumstances, to grant a personal title, not a diplomatic or political one, but a name given directly by the royal household to a being whose presence had changed something that was worth the changing. The title granted to Corporal Davin Holt was Velcarathi Yen Theron, which translated from formal Thyranai as he who walks without armor. The Chancellor explained that in Thyranai culture, armor meant not only physical protection but also the full layered structure of performance, management, and careful self-presentation that beings in positions of power spent their entire lives constructing around themselves, so that nothing real could reach them and nothing real could escape. To walk without it was to be genuinely, completely, and vulnerably yourself in every room you entered, and to do so not out of ignorance but out of a specific kind of quiet courage that could not be learned from a briefing document. Davin received this information with the expression of someone who was genuinely moved and was working hard not to show that to 40 strangers. Then he asked if it came with a badge. There was a short and lovely pause. Then the Chancellor, who had not smiled openly at a formal function in longer than anyone at the table could remember, smiled, not a diplomatic smile, but a real one, and said he would see what could be arranged. 6 months later, the galaxy had moved on to its next collection of crises and negotiations and carefully worded concerns, the way the galaxy always did, because it was very large and had the short memory of something that always had more pressing business ahead of it. But some things had changed and stayed changed. The human delegation now had a permanent upgraded facility at Velshoreth. The Kthari had opened a direct communication channel with Earth, the first they had established with any outside species in 30 years. The Soluvian Queen had submitted a trade proposal so generous that the human economics team had read it 4 times looking for the part where it stopped being generous, found no such part, and cautiously and gratefully accepted. And in a particular park, in a particular city, on a fairly ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the light was doing something warm and golden through the trees and there was no particular reason to be anywhere important, 2 people were sitting on a bench sharing a bag of chips and watching a small cluster of pigeons engage in a surprisingly intense dispute over a dropped pretzel. One of them was wearing a very large hood and a pair of dark glasses that she had been assured would help her blend in with the local population and that were not, in any visible way, helping her blend in with the local population. One of them was wearing a regular jacket and old comfortable shoes and had a small badge on his collar engraved with Velcarathi and the Ron in Thyronai script so small that no one on Earth had yet been able to read it. "They are fighting quite seriously over something very small," said Asiriel, watching the pigeons with the focused analytical attention she normally reserved for treaty negotiations. "Yeah, they do that," said Davin. "It seems profoundly inefficient." "It is extremely inefficient," he agreed, completely unbothered by this. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that only exists between two people who have fully run out of the need to fill it with anything, and are glad about that. Then Asiriel said, quietly, "I like it here." Davin turned and looked at her. "Yeah." "It is loud," she said, "and it smells unusual, and everything moves faster than seems strictly necessary." She paused for a moment, looking at the trees, and at the pigeons, and at the perfectly ordinary street beyond the park gate. "I like it very much." He smiled at her, the same smile he had given her the first time, the one that had no performance in it and no agenda behind it and no calculation underneath it anywhere, the smile of someone who was simply and completely glad to be exactly where he was. "Hey, sweetie," he said. She turned and looked at him. And for the third time, deep and luminous and perfectly involuntary, the same as the first time and every single time in between and every time that was still ahead of them, her cheeks glowed violet. "Yes, darling," she said. And the galaxy, very far away and full of very important things, could absolutely wait a little longer.